Go ahead now.
Yeah, so welcome. This is the Des Moines Citizens Task Force for Sustainability. My name is Brian Campbell. I've been a member of the task force for about 3 years, and this is the third in our sort of new format that we're using to have once a month. We have meetings like this that are really informational about different topics related to sustainability in the city of Des Moines. And this really fits with our mission as a task force to engage with the community and serve as an advisory role to the city of Des Moines around all different aspects of sustainability. So we had a conversation about transportation and about stormwater. Tonight's topic is about climate action planning. And this has really been the key goal for the task force for the last several years, is trying to lay the foundation for where we are now as a city of drafting a climate action plan and really making some commitments to policies and collaborations in the city to help us meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals and help us be more resilient in the face of climate change. So I'm going to turn the meeting over to Jeremy Caron, who can introduce himself and the other guests for tonight.
Hey everyone, my name is Jeremy Caron. I'm the new Sustainability Program Manager with the City of Des Moines. I think a number of you have been introduced to me at previous meetings, and I've been an active member of the task force since I moved to the Des Moines area a while ago, and not nearly as long as Brian, but excited to be a part of it, and glad to be on board with the city now to help continue to move forward the mission of sustainability across the city and partner with everyone from the task force. And so for tonight, we actually have with us also Pa Golbeck, who is also a city employee and has been in part of the finance department within the city manager's office, and has been handling the majority of the sustainability program management over the last year or two. And so she'll provide some input, has a little more institutional knowledge at this point than I do. And then we also have Barbara Buffaloe from the city of Columbia, Missouri, who's going to spend some time speaking about the climate action and adaptation plan that they put together for their community, which is well-regarded model effort that we've seen presented in a few different places recently, and some great takeaways from that work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara, and just to give you a little more background on Barbara. So she's the sustainability manager for the city of Columbia and a graduate of the University of Missouri with bachelor's and master's degrees in environment and behavior. And she's been working with the city to advance a more sustainable, vital, and well-planned future for Columbia, and has partnered with a lot of the community stakeholders to drive those efforts forward. So you're going to learn a lot about that over the next, I'm not sure how long your presentation is, Barbara, but half an hour, 45 minutes or so, and then that'll lead into myself and Pa providing some updates on what the city's plans are, City of Des Moines' plans are moving forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Barbara.
Okay.
Let her get going.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know, guys, if you can you see my screen? Okay, I see heads nodding, so you might just be nodding to a person behind the screen or to me. I'm going to go with me. Well, thanks, guys, for having me. I'm Barbara Buffaloe. Like Jeremy said, I'm the Sustainability Manager for the City of Columbia, Missouri. I apologize if I'm glowing. I walked home very fast in order to be with you guys today, because it was just in case it got loud downtown for protests. But I wanted to first state that So first off, I'm going to be talking about our development of our climate action and adaptation plan in a pre-COVID world. In a pre-COVID world, still a racially unjust world, but a pre-COVID world. And so when I talk about some of the community engagement that we did, it might not look the same for as Des Moines works on some of their work. So just apologies to that. But one of the things that I know a lot of staff have been looking into is how to do more virtual engagement and more actually one-to-one engagement with community members as they come up with their plan and the actions that they're going to take. So I start with that kind of disclosure at the beginning. So in the city of Columbia, let me go to this. Like any other community, climate action planning process starts with inventorying of your greenhouse gas emissions. We did this. We worked on researching our climate trends with actually our colleagues in Iowa City, with the university, actually, and also Iowa State, University of Nebraska, University of Kansas, University of Missouri, and Oklahoma, looking at climate trends in the Midwest. We then forecasted those changes and the impacts that would happen locally so that we could then adopt goals and create an action plan that was useful to the city of Columbia. We're now in our implementation phase of those policies that we adopted by policy resolution last June, and we're monitoring our progress going forward. So this is a quick kind of timeline of how we did our plan. We started, I mean, technically kind of we've been doing a lot of this work for a long time, but the impetus behind our climate action plan started with back in June 2017 with our mayor signing on for the Mayor's for Climate and Environment and saying that he wanted us to create a plan. So we formed a task force, which sounds similar to what you have going on in Des Moines. And that task force started meeting in February 2018. We had 3 community workshops throughout this time, which I'm going to say a number, and now you're going to be like, that many people can't get together. But we had about 150 people at each of our workshops that we had throughout the planning process. We had a task force of 15 members, with also an internal staff task force and local regional experts on a lot of the subject matters when we came to evaluating the actions in our plan. Like I mentioned earlier, our plan was adopted by policy resolution in June of 2019, and now we've just been working on getting it implemented. So this is a quick snapshot of our, you might see my face over some of these people. I don't know what you guys see as far as your Zoom faces, but here's our 15 members of our task force that we had. We did have a few cycle off throughout the planning process due to job relocations. What I'd like to point out in this picture is that we had different groups represented in our task force that was guiding how these actions, the data was evaluated and how the actions were developed. So we had everything from small businesses, high school students, large residential developer, a local brewer, scientist, insurance industries, journalism, transportation advocates, Sierra Club members. We've had University of Missouri representatives and environmental lawyers and more and more. So it was a good group to pull together. Yeah, so I miss some of them, but we have formed a commission and some of them I still see. So some of the things that we had early on, let's see, sorry, I saw a chat and I didn't know. It was technically 18 months, but I appreciate your optimism that it was 1 year. It felt like 6 months, but anyway, sorry to interrupt myself. So some of our projected temperature changes and precipitation changes that we were designing for were that we currently have about 5 days above 95 degrees on average, and that by mid-century we would experience 50 days above 2050, or by mid-century, and that our coldest day would be warmer. We would also expect to see a small increase in our precipitation, but the issue that we would have more is when that would happen, which would be more in the spring and in the fall. So we would have it more when we were doing planting and not as much when we needed it to actually water our crops and in the gardens that we have. And the projection showed that those would be heavier rain events. So as we design for the 100-year flood, 500-year flood, all of those, we would have to design for those more frequently. So the task force then took those projected changes, and staff also reviewed those and told some of the things that we would be worried about what those climate changes or weather changes would do to our operations. And so then the task force evaluated the vulnerabilities on what would be a high vulnerability and a low vulnerability. And where this is important is when we were evaluating the actions to actually get into our plan. One of the criteria you'll see that we evaluated was on, is it addressing a vulnerability or an emission reduction that we needed to do? So that's where these came into play. So the first of our big community workshop that we did was at our area recreational center. And we were asking a few things. First, we had broken out into, we started as a big group, and then we broke out into smaller groups over like topical areas like transportation, built environment, waste, health, and natural resources. And with those, we were asking a few questions. We were first asking, what's your vision for the future? What should we be envisioning for our community? Because no plan is, I guess, a planning process unless you have a vision. We then were asking the questions of, what actions do you often hear come up under these subject areas? Like, what sort of actions would you think would be in a plan to help either improve our resilience or decrease our emissions? And then we asked, how would those actions negatively affect our vulnerable populations? Or how would the actions, or how would those changes negatively affect our vulnerable populations? And how might the proposed actions negatively affect our vulnerable populations? And the reason why we did that is that it was very important for us to center our plan in equity. We started with one of my colleagues at the Inclusive Impact Institute, starting off the meeting reminding everybody that if you have a brain, you have a bias, and we all have our own learned experiences and our own environments that we grow up in. And so as you're developing a plan that will impact thousands of community members, you need to remember that before we just go forward with same old, same old. So in August of 2018, we went to City Council with the emission reduction goals that we wanted to set the plan for. So Council, we have kind of two tracks of our emission goals. First off, we have our overall 100% by 2060. So the 80% by 2050, which is kind of the industry standard, I guess you could say, with a mid check-in goal of 35% by 2035. And then because we're a municipal, we're in charge of so much at the city, it was important to have our own goals for the city of Columbia as an operations. So we have our own stricter goal of 50% by 35 and 100% by 2050. I mentioned earlier those vulnerabilities, and so where our vulnerabilities came into especially was in our criteria for evaluating these actions. Now, fast forward, our plan still has 165 actions in it, which is overwhelming to say the least, but we had to evaluate more, obviously, than that. I think we had something close to 400 actions that the task force, the internal staff team, and our regional experts helped us evaluate. And we were evaluating over 5 different criteria, looking at the effectiveness of the action, like would it actually improve our resilience or reduce our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions? Was it affordable? Did we either have the funding to do it, or also would it negatively affect, like could other people help pay for it, or even just pay for it? Was it feasible, or did it require additional research or information? Was it equitable? So did it address the needs of those vulnerable populations and our frontline communities? And did it help reduce the vulnerability to those populations? And then we had co-benefits, which is, our sustainability office, we're a division of the city manager's office, and it doesn't do any good if I have one plan and then community development, our developer and planning group have another plan. So we wanted to make sure that our goals were aligned with other community plans that were out there. So like our strategic plan, comprehensive plan, and others. There's also a 6th criteria that came into play later on, and that was community support. But we couldn't obviously evaluate that until we had asked the community. And we couldn't ask the community until we had the action. So that one came up after our next get together. But so to evaluate, and I'm happy to share this with you guys, this was kind of our decision matrix that helped us evaluate how to score those different actions that we had. And so you can see in the top right, we had kind of a workshop where we all got together and each personally scored the actions of a different subject area. And then we worked out and like came to consensus of that group to put it up. That did not just happen in one workshop. This is where I might actually scare you. This happened over 16 subcommittee meetings in a month and a half. So if you're the staff liaison who's trying to organize this, that you might just explode your head a little bit. But what we wanted to do was to make sure that every action was effectively monitored and evaluated. And we wanted to make sure that we were fair to all the ideas that were brought forth to us. So we did this by doing breakouts. And so at that table that you see at the top right, that has some city staff, some task force members, and then no one in that one is there, but we also would have some of our like local researchers or local experts that would also come and provide their input. All of those then went to our task force for final evaluation and adoption. So with those actions, we went out to the community. We had a survey monkey go out in the fall of 2018, where we asked people to, would you invest your tax dollars in these actions? Or questions like, if, because there are actions in there about, like, for instance, 100% renewable energy. And so the question was phrased more of, would you pay 10 to 15% more on your utility bill if it meant 100% renewable energy? Or would you pay 20 to 35? So basically, where was the support for what would need to happen or what the cost would be to meet some of those actions? We also asked the obvious of, do you think it's important that we're doing this? Do you think it's important that we take action to prepare, and should we be proactive in it? And I'll say, so I don't know if I mentioned this, the city of Columbia is about 125,000 people, and we had 1,900, we had 1,000 respondents to this survey. So pretty good percentage for a survey of our small city. Oh, here's an example. I didn't even have to read it to you. So this is some of the questions. The way that we phrased the actions was in question form. So like, I would support establishing a goal of 100% renewable energy, even if electricity cost, and then the different percentages. And so then you can kind of see how they responded. So then we went and had another community workshop. So November, this is November, it's kind of right after Thanksgiving. We again had the mayor do the kickoff, started out together, and then broke out into the rooms. And in the rooms, all of the actions were there. And when you entered the room, you were given, I guess, like 5 stickers per room. And that was supposed to be the equivalent of your tax dollars. So you were supposed to put those things out there. Seeing these kids reminds me, at both the spring workshop and also the fall workshop, we had activities for kids. One thing that we had to pivot, and I regret not planning for better at our spring one, was that the kids had a voice too. We had childcare, obviously, for like the younger kids, but there was the in-between ages where they were not feeling like they were like a property owner or even a college student age, but that, the junior high and the high school students who also have a very, very strong role to play in this discussion. And so there were some of that we ended up having a separate breakout for just the youth. And I think that was one of the things that I wish we had planned for better at the earlier one. And then this one, we had some activities for the younger kids to do where people they were kind of coloring. We had a local artist had made a mural for us, and we took pieces of it and made these postcards, and then the kids were coloring on it. And then on the back was a way for you to set your own pledge for what you wanted to do for climate action. So it was a nice activity. The next steps in our plan development was to take all of those actions that rated high, and the task force approved of which ones they wanted to put into the plan. And then this is a really good part where we had partnered with Cascadia Consulting Group. And they put, as a consultant, took the data from the potential greenhouse gas emissions of those actions and helped us model out what would that decrease be. So for instance, all of our actions related to reducing energy in our commercial industry would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by this much. And they have their different sort of models for like, at what percentage do they think the uptick would be. This was super helpful to have a consultant do, because I know next to nothing about doing some of that data modeling. I can track things, but I don't necessarily know how to do the data model going forward. So it helped to have an expert that did. And then you'll see our goals are in there too, like our 35% by 2035 and our 80% reduction by 2050. We then we were kind of evaluating what those numbers mean and fine tuning the actions that were going into the plan. Some of these actions were not 100% supported by the entire task force. So then we would bring in other experts to kind of help them make a decision. Like the bottom one there, they're actually having a discussion about whether or not to allow burning of wood as an action at our municipal power plant. And so having experts come in from the different industries and have presentations was one of the ways that we helped come to a consensus for the group and what went into the plan. So then we went out for another survey for our community where we had the plan out, and we were asking them, should city council adopt this? And do you think that it's giving us strong direction? We did have some that said that city council should not adopt it. The consensus for most of those responses was because they didn't even believe climate change was an issue. And so we gave all the information for council when we submitted the plan. And so I will say on some of the feedback though that we did receive, we did then incorporate it into the action. That which was constructive feedback. So concerns over implementation, we talked about some of the cost implications, or making sure that if some things had a lot of support in it, whether or not we should move it from, we have kind of two action tracks. One is a priority action. Those are actions that either need to happen before other actions can happen in order to set the foundation, or like they're so important, they will help move the difference and we need to work on them faster. And then the other ones, which are actions we want to work on, but they might either not be feasible with the current systems, or they need more research into doing something, or there's just not the capacity to implement those just yet. One of my favorite parts of our plan is something that I blatantly stole from our colleagues in Flagstaff, Arizona. This is the tension points. Because it was important for us to raise a voice to the fact that we know that not all climate goals align with other goals within the city. While we mentioned earlier about our co-benefits of working with our comprehensive plan and with our strategic plan, it's very obvious that there will be some times where there will be tension between two of these goals. And by bringing them to light and talking about them, it helped establish that the plan was first and foremost not developed through rose-colored glasses, but also that it will start that conversation. So, for the example of scope 3 emissions are not included. A lot of in our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, we're not tracking the emissions that are associated with the items that are created in Seattle and shipped to Columbia. We only track them from transportation when they get in here and then the waste when they're thrown away. So we know that we're missing out on a big part of the pie that is Columbia's emissions. However, it's a harder one for us to track, and it's not in most of the protocols. So it's acknowledging that, and acknowledging that a lot of our waste actions that are in our plan are related to reducing the emissions that we do track, but that we are aware of the other ones. That's just an example. Sorry. I think I might, yeah. So next is about implementing the action and adaptation plan, so once it's adopted. And so what we're doing for that is that first off, in the plan, we have implementation strategies. They have 3 goals, which are basically, to establish climate action as a priority and to create a commission to advise and monitor. to establish the priorities into the City of Columbia as an organization and make sure that it's aligned with our budget and with our city manager's direction. And the third is to strengthen our city's staff capacity so that we can effectively implement community climate action into Columbia. And so how we're implementing the plan is that we have 5 internal strategic priority issue teams: clean energy, healthy housing, good stewards, clean transportation, and resource stewardship. The good stewards one is about basically city operations, so both our facilities and the property that we manage. And then resource stewardship is more on the external stewardship that we are responsible, or resources that we're responsible for. So the landfill and some of our native areas. We also have a public commission that I mentioned, the Climate and Environment Commission. The Climate and Environment Commission replaced an existing Environment and Energy Commission that had been formed in the 70s. And it was a time for that commission to reevaluate their scope, which had never changed since 1979 when they were established. And it allowed them also to decide whether or not they wanted to kind of strengthen what their feedback loop would be to the City Council. We also have monthly internal reports, which is done through a simple Google form that I allow departments to kind of fill out, and then I compile and give to the city manager. And then we're working on a report to council every January on kind of where we are with greenhouse gas emissions and also implementation of the plan. I will note on that one is that one way that we're also doing the report to City Council is that I have a section in the city manager's budget that goes to council in July and is adopted in September, where I talk about the different departments, what they are doing, and new this year, I get to add what they could have done. So I'm a little bit nervous about making enemies. So we'll see what I decide to do with that one. But most important is those strategic priority teams. So they're going to act as those kind of creative engines that are, they're going to both look at the plans and the actions in the plan, but we also want them to have that sort of ability to identify opportunities and projects that they want to work on and they think will help achieve the climate action plan goals, and to bring them forward for the group to evaluate. This is just a quick overview. I can share you guys the slide deck when I'm done. But basically, these are some of the responsibilities of those teams, and basically to help us with being those subject matter experts and putting together the projects, but then also helping us kind of staff on putting together the data that we want to put for their key performance indicators. Those are the 5 teams. All right. I mentioned the priority actions earlier. One of the other things that we developed before the plan went to council was looking at some of those actions that had been identified as priorities, and then figuring out a little bit of these are kind of answering the questions that we expected council to ask us. Like, who will you work with? How much will the cost be? Where are you going to get the funding from it? And what are your key next steps? So this is just a snapshot of some of those priority actions and laying out some of those questions that we expect. So these are our first pass at those. And now the SPIT teams, I should not call them that, but that's what Strategic Priority Initiative Team shortens to. They're reviewing those now to see whether or not there are different key next steps that they think that they would like to apply. Those key next steps then have their key performance indicators for our implementation. And these are going to go into a community dashboard. So we have a dashboard up right now that is kind of the storytelling behind our climate action adaptation plan. It's comoclimateaction.org. And on there, you'll see kind of the charts. And on the right there, that's kind of our current renewable energy capacity for some of our solar systems. And then there's other charts that kind of show us where our goals are for that. Oh, and then that's it. That's the end of me.
Thank you. I'm trying to get people unmuted here. Thank you. That was really good.
Thanks.
Brian?
You know, there's that moment where I couldn't see you guys anymore. And then I was like, what if I'm just talking to like my wall in my bedroom and no one else is here anymore? Sorry.
So there's a couple of people who've typed questions. You can type questions in the chat and we can try to read them from there. And then I can also see who might want to state their questions. So Dan, do you want to ask what you were throwing out earlier about work with consultants?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. I know that there's a lot of consultants that could be used here. Specifically, I was thinking with the crafting of the survey. So did you consult with a survey company to get your survey drafted and distributed?
So we had partnered with our project, we had partnered with a consultant for the plans development. And so we used them as kind of and I actually just had a call with them last week because they were like, okay, it's a year out. Like, how did we do for you? And I was like, here's where I think you guys are the best. I think our consultant was best used for putting together the, evaluating the data. I think I could have used, but this is also just because of also like the way that Columbia works. And I imagine Des Moines is very similar in that we probably could have used a consultant bringing us, what are some of like the most common actions you see that are effective in plans and other things? Do you think that we should be considering here? But I don't know, like, I don't know if Des Moines is very similar to Columbia. We're like, oh, no, we're different. We have to do everything totally fresh and from scratch, even though like a lot of it looks very similar. The other thing though, with the survey questions, what I would say is, you know, they had done maybe a first pass on one of our surveys, and I wasn't as excited about it. And I think the reason why is because we are the experts in our community, right? So we're the experts in our neighborhoods, and our community members that are taking the survey are the experts in their community too, in their neighborhood. So we need to write it for them. So having my consultant who is based in Seattle write it was not really, I don't know what the word to say, like it just wasn't adequate for me. And so we wrote, especially our second survey questions, where I was like, would you be willing? Would you take action on this? It was written from a Columbia perspective.
Did the consultant crunch the data for you as well from the survey responses?
They did for that. Yep.
Cool, thank you.
Carolyn, you had a question about the mix of people who were part of this process and the teams.
Yeah, so we had oh, there you are.
Hi. Yeah, I just wondered about minorities being represented. I don't know what your minority representation is in Columbia.
Yeah, so we're at about 12% of our community is represented from the Black and Brown population. One of the things that we talk about often within our communities of color is while we only had a few minorities on our task force, what we would do for our partnering were to go out into established neighborhood groups and work with them there, rather than expecting them to come to the groups we were meeting within. One of the things that I think, so our strategic plan the year previous had been doing community outreach in our neighborhoods. And one of the things that did us a little bit of a disservice is that nothing happened from that community outreach. And so what you see often happening is that, well, it's kind of like, why would I talk to you when you guys didn't do anything with the data I gave you the last time? And so part of it for us, what was important was that we pulled all the previous data that came from that planning process with the neighborhood outreach, from a comprehensive plan with the neighborhood outreach, so that we could reflect and respect on what had already been said. And then we took that into the development of the plan. So while there might not have been as much through the development of this plan, previously stated comments and preferences and statements were then incorporated into how we evaluated this one.
Thank you.
Oh, let me see. There's another one about how did we, wait, no, I'm not very good with scrolling right now. How did we market our workshops? So for our workshops, which we did, and again, guys, it's pre-COVID, so like what I'm gonna say might not be relevant right now, and I don't know when it will be. I don't know what Des Moines numbers are like, but just right now, what we're talking about. So for our community outreach, for our workshops that we had, well, first off, we had it a public space that had both lots of parking, but was also on a bus line. We had childcare available, and we served food for dinner. Which again, I can't even imagine putting out like a buffet of food right now with like 150 people coming, but this, maybe the days will change. So one of the things that we then did to help also ensure was that by doing those things, it made it a little bit easier for having additional representation there and having more people come. And then to get out the word on it, we put it both in our insert that goes into utility bills, we put it onto social media, and then our task force, which represented 15 different types of groups within Columbia, were all tasked with helping get the word out within their own networks. Because we knew that like me putting it out in the newspaper is one thing versus your neighbor telling you about this thing that they were gonna go to next Wednesday. So I think that got us a lot of, I think that's why we got so many people of different groups attending it.
So one of the other questions that just got asked, Allison, do you wanna ask it?
Sure. So I just downloaded the plan, just so I can look at the words and all that. And obviously the first thing is the city council's resolution. And at the bottom it says that this is advisory only, that there are no regulatory pieces that come out of this. And so I'm just wondering if there was any discussion among council members or the actual kind of planning teams and task force about that. And on the other end, if there's any hindrances you're finding from it being advisory only.
So it's advisory in that it's advising policy development. So the plan is a policy resolution, and our policy resolutions, so resolution, one read, non-binding. Policy resolution is directing the policy development for our city government ordinances and codes. And then ordinance is like putting it into code. So it's put there as advisory only in that it's advising city staff on how to put together our policies and programs. So for the city manager, he wanted to make sure that it was a policy resolution, namely so that it was not just advisory and feel good. And so for us, for our policy resolution, we then take the goals that are in there, like for instance, in our energy section, there's a piece on doing, moving our municipal electric utility to 100% renewable energy. So we didn't, if it were to be in code into ordinances, then we would have to have our ordinance with that, with the plan that was adopted. So where we are now is that we are adopting, or we're developing the ordinance that will show how we're going to meet our 100% renewable energy, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I had a question about, Barbara, how you get all the different city departments working together on these different goals, so they're communicating with each other, and so they're working together.
So in part, it's because of the city manager as a leader. So the city manager, as our leadership within our organization, has stated that this is the way that we do business. And so then in our biweekly meetings with department heads, like I'm always there. And so I'm able to ask that question of kind of like, where are we on this? The other way is to, right now, we're currently trying to figure out how to also put some of these pieces into the budget so that it's measured on their pieces. The other way is just, that simple Google sheet that I have, or Google form that I have, where it's kind of a good, you don't necessarily have to tell me that you've implemented and acted and established, the actions for goal C1, 2, 3 or whatever. But you can just tell me a project that you've done, and that's great. Like even if it's not falling within those, and then we can kind of give that feedback back to the city manager. It's not perfect, And in Columbia's, you know what I mean? I still have departments that are like, well, we don't really have to do that, do we? And I was like, you go tell the city manager that you're not looking at energy efficiency at the new airport terminal. And so that's, you know, that it's kind of through that. And it's going to take time, which we don't really have, but we're working on.
Dan, go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll go to Sheila after Dan. All right, you just want us to read it? So,
Dan, do you know you're muted?
It sounds like he
It
can't.
wouldn't be a Zoom call if
There
someone
we
was
go.
talking muted.
No, I can't control my mute and unmute, so I muted myself after my first question. Sorry. About
I
that.
actually have changed that so that
Oh, okay.
everybody can do it. So,
Okay, cool. My question was, I work in affordable housing currently, and I work for Habitat, and I made the case to the Habitat that we should have representation as like official like members of the task force. And I was just wondering how some of those tension point conversations have played out, if you've had any of them yet, between, you know, the sustainability initiative and the affordable housing initiatives.
Well, they're still playing out, obviously, because yeah, it's a tension point for reals.
Sure.
I think so. We had a couple in there, right? So we have two of our tension points are touching on this. One is about land preservation, and it's also thinking about like neighborhood connectivity or neighborhood cohesiveness, because that's one of the discussions that a lot of people have. They're like, well, are you saying that you would rather build more homes in an area rather than have open space, or that you would have or that you would take down community character to build more energy efficient housing? And so where we see that happening is that, so Columbia has a really good community land trust. It's still somewhat new. It's probably about 5 years old. But you know, they've taken it to heart, and our CDBG office is fantastic. They've been working for a while on making sure that they're building better than even code, like more energy efficient for doing that. And so what we're able to do, because we have that model, is that we're able to highlight that when we say like what we're talking about. Like when I'm talking about energy efficient, affordable housing that's also like thinking about the natural environment, I'm talking about like one of our like our Lynn Street cottages, which has you know, a stormwater rain garden areas on it. It has solar panels that were put on it. We did it with our CDBG funds in partnership with both Habitat for Humanity and then also another local regional developer with our land trust.
What's the
so
name
that's
what's the name of that
Lynn.
project?
So the project is called the Lynn Street Cottages. And it's, I think, can't remember if I highlighted in the plan or if we highlighted in our vulnerability action parts of the plan. But yeah, so Lynn Street Cottages is a perfect example of what we're trying to model that we're talking about.
Thank you.
and then Sheila, you were next.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for being here, Barbara. This has been really interesting, and I've kind of been preparing dinner as I've been listening. So
Okay, I'm hearing my 7-year-old yell, so we're totally good.
So I'm not sure if I caught everything that you've been saying, but I was curious. You've talked about, you know, you've really tried to bring social equity into things, and you've looked at vulnerability. And I see a lot of climate action plans are dealing, it seems mostly with, you know, the reduction of greenhouse gases through energy independence and efficiency. But, you know, to me, it also has to include things like emergency response and food security. And I was just wondering if you had looked at those areas as well.
Yeah, so ours is a climate action and adaptation plan for that reason, to make sure, because you can't have one without the other.
Right.
And so we have in our plan, we have a health, safety and well-being section. Okay. And a lot of that talks about access to both access like food security, access to our SNAP benefits, and to the different kind of social services that we have that help create a resilient community. we have pieces in there about emergency preparedness, which in light of this last spring, I really wish we had like worked on that one as soon as we adopted the plan, but you know,
Yeah.
hindsight. And then for the, and also thinking about, someone had mentioned about like carbon sequestration, we also have our natural resources section also in ours. And that's where we're looking at, and we're actually working on right now with our regional network on a tool to evaluate carbon sequestration on publicly owned lands and private lands, on how we can help kind of give a value to those types of practices. Because, you know, I mentioned like greenhouse gas emissions is an easy thing to measure, kind of. Like it's a thing to measure, and then I can measure how much energy was used, and then I know where my energy comes from, and so then I can put the emissions together. But it's hard with some of those other things to do. Like we talk about social cost of carbon in our plan, and we evaluated some of the actions on the potential for achieving that and assisting with that. But it's hard when you're talking to some of the other stakeholders, because there's not a dollar value with carbon sequestration or with some of those like social service ones that you can give them as a savings just yet. And so we're trying to develop that narrative and have more of those discussions so that that triple bottom line is still a part of the discussion.
So are you also looking at like including urban farming, encouraging urban farming? Because I've been told that cities are going to need to produce 40 to 60% of the food we eat within the local area.
So for ours, I'm trying to look at it really quick. Let's see. So we have a goal for reducing emissions associated with the food system. And with that, it has an increasing production of local food. So that's through supporting the organizations that are doing that, reviewing our ordinances and regulations to promote urban farming, working with our economic development on entrepreneurship programs for commercial urban farming, and updating our code and incentives to help preserve our topsoil so that we have better soil to provide for our community gardens.
Great.
And then we do a little bit more about the assuring of the food security.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's in the health, safety, and well-being section.
So thanks so much for presenting. We could keep talking to you for a long, long time. We've been, working and dreaming about climate action planning for years. And so I'm sure we'll have opportunities for follow-up as we continue in the process. And I would encourage people to do like Allison and download the plan and look at it. And we'll have lots more to talk about as we work.
Yeah, blatantly steal as much as you want.
Yeah, and one thing I also wanted to say, so it's obvious that leadership from the city is really vital. So we're excited that Scott Sanders, our city manager, joined a little bit, just a couple minutes into the call, and that Jeremy Caron and Pa Golbeck and Jim Hoff are all here as well to talk about what the process is going to look like for the city of Des Moines. So thanks to Barbara, and now we can turn it over to Jeremy.
I was gonna say, can I pop off? Because I did hear a 7-year-old yell at his 9-year-old sister. Okay, thanks guys. Jeremy, I look forward to talking with you now that you're in this position.
Thanks,
Yep.
Barbara. Appreciate it.
Yep, see you guys. Good luck.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Barbara.
Great. Well, now that Barbara's really set the bar extremely high for our purposes of climate action and adaptation planning, I wanted to mention that the example from Columbia is just one of many fantastic plans that have been put together around the country by a lot of municipal governments. And I think in our efforts moving forward, we really want to draw from all of those plans. And one of the unique things about a lot of the municipal governments is that they're really open to sharing those resources and not reinventing the wheel where you don't have to. But it's obviously something where we know it's really important to have that local perspective and that stakeholder input from the local community to really drive plans forward and hone in on the specific action areas that are critical to that particular city, and in this case, Des Moines. And so we want to make sure that that's an integral part of the process moving forward. And so, I think the current situation we're in with the pandemic is certainly going to influence things. And I think the last week has really brought to light a lot of the equity issues that we're going to need to deal with as part of this planning process, and how it can help to improve our communities and strengthen the city moving forward. So with that, I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. We have a few slides that we've put together just to kind of walk you through what we're planning. And can you see that?
Yeah, we've got it.
All right,
I've got
great. So myself and Pa will be the primary participants through this presentation, and we'll certainly open it up to Jim and Scott if they want to chime in as well. But this is, we wanted to take an opportunity here, not just to talk through the climate action planning process, but also give you an update on sort of what our priorities are for essentially the first year of my work with the city. So to highlight those, implementation of the building energy and water benchmarking ordinance is going to be one of the major components of the work that I do over the next year or so with the city. And Pa's been doing a fantastic job of managing this for the last year or so, and has been working really closely with our public building owners as well as the commercial building owners to implement the ordinance. And this year, as many of you know, is the first year that the commercial building owners need to report their energy use. And COVID-19 has certainly had its impact on that effort as well. And so we'll have some updates on the schedule and timeline for the implementation of that ordinance as part of this presentation. And then we're certainly going to talk some more about the climate action and adaptation plan process. Some other work we're also involved in, we serve in an advisory capacity to Iowa State University, who received a grant to explore the nexus of food, energy, and water, and develop a framework that addresses those challenges for urban environments, and with Des Moines as an example. So that process is gearing up and will be kicking off I think later this year, and we'll be playing a role in that effort as well. And we'll have further updates as that starts to move forward. Another component is high performance buildings and LEED certification. The city of Des Moines has committed to LEED certified facilities for the new construction projects, and the majority of city buildings that have been built in recent years have actually achieved LEED silver. But there are certainly, beyond LEED, there are certainly other components of building design that are really important, including indoor environmental quality, which is incorporated into LEED, but is its own element as well, and energy performance and renewable energy. And so we want to try to focus on some of those goals and integrate that into some of the work that we're doing moving forward. A lot of work has been done around identifying energy efficiency improvement opportunities in the existing building stock for city facilities. And so we'll be reviewing that and identifying which of those projects make the most sense financially and from a technical feasibility standpoint, and implementing some of those as well moving forward. And electric vehicles and electric vehicle service equipment and infrastructure are certainly a really big component. There are a lot of funds available in Iowa through the Volkswagen settlement funding. The city's working on trying to leverage some of those funds to improve EV infrastructure throughout the city. And I'm currently working on a electric vehicle analysis toolkit that helps communities identify electric vehicle growth within the community and the growth of requirements of related infrastructure to support that. And so that'll be a component of our work moving forward. And then integrating sustainability principles into city operations and services. And a lot of that work, you know, there's been a lot of successful work around that already, and it may not always be presented as a sustainability project or program that's offered through the city. But there are a lot of things that we've already done moving and plan to do moving forward that I think are going to make a big difference. And we want to make sure that we recognize and understand those as we're starting this climate action and adaptation planning process. And, you know, a couple examples of those are the tree inventory. So we understand what the canopy coverage is around the city and how that can impact the comfort within our city, the access to clean air and the environmental benefits of living in that type of environment, as well as the Tiny Trees program and stormwater mitigation grants as well. Examples of those include some grants for rain barrels for residential homeowners and rain gardens. So those are just a few examples of some of the sustainability efforts the city has undertaken in the past, and and you know, we'll be pursuing a lot more moving forward here. Pod, did you want to add anything on that?
No, but I don't think so. Thanks.
All right. All right. So a timeline of programs and initiatives that we're looking to implement over the next year or so. So, as I mentioned, the building benchmarking program is a really important component of our work over the next year. The city's own building benchmarking data will go live on July 1st. So we're working diligently this month to get that information ready to go live. And you'll be able to see that pretty soon here. And then August 28th is the deadline for submission for the commercial building owners for 2019 building energy use data. That is, the original due date was May 1st, and in light of COVID-19, we've extended that out to August 28th. November 1st, we plan to start analyzing benchmarking data for the annual report and the awards that we plan to provide to building owners, and then we'll be preparing for round 2 of the benchmarking notifications for the 2020 building energy and water use data. There will certainly be a lot of lessons learned that we've had over the last several years of implementing this, and we'll be working that into the program moving forward to improve the delivery of that program and the resources that are available to building owners from the city. And then beginning in January of 2021, we'll be completing that annual benchmarking report. We'll be recognizing building owners, and we'll have some more information on that a little bit later here in the presentation, and that'll be through City Council. And then early next year, we'll continue to provide benchmarking technical assistance sessions. We've already offered a number of those throughout this year prior to the original deadline, and then we've actually added some virtual ones that are available now for building owners to get assistance, and we've had several of those over the last 3 weeks or so here, and a few more scheduled for next week as well. And then we will be developing for the next budget cycle a budget for the climate and adaptation action planning process. And hopefully that budget draft will get approved in March of next year. And then we can start putting together an RFP for hiring our consultant and who we're planning to partner with for that process. And then May 1st of 2021 will be the deadline for the 2020 building data, provided there are no unforeseen circumstances that impact that in 2021. And then we'll be kicking off in July our work on the climate adaptation and action plan. And like Barbara mentioned, that planning process can take anywhere from a year to 18 months to 2 years, depending upon the community and the level of engagement and involvement you have with your stakeholders throughout the community. And certainly we need to remain flexible as we do this, given the current circumstances, and adapt to that as needed so that we can get the best possible product out of that effort. So I just wanted to run through some of the information related to the benchmarking ordinance to give folks a little bit more background on that, who may be less familiar with that effort in the city of Des Moines. And so benchmarking ordinances around the country, there are upwards of 20 or so ordinances throughout the country right now for municipal governments. And the majority of them have demonstrated 3% or more decrease in energy use, but at least 3% across the city. So that they have a pretty substantial impact. It may look like a small percentage, but when you tally up the energy and water savings associated with that, it's a pretty large amount of resources. And so then understanding the data helps building owners to make informed decisions about improvements to their facilities. It helps the cities to design programs and incentives that help building owners improve their facilities as well. And that will certainly be a major component of this ordinance. And then it leads the way on driving greenhouse gas reductions in Des Moines. And then some long-term benchmarking goals. We want to understand the level of energy and water use in municipal, commercial, and multifamily sectors. Ultimately, having that data, you can't really fix what you can't measure. And having that data will certainly help us to plan actions and priorities that make a difference within the communities. And normalize the practice of using energy and water benchmarking to identify efficiencies and improve building performance. There are certainly a number of ways that this data can be analyzed and trended to identify improvement opportunities, and not a lot of benchmarking programs utilize that as effectively as they could, and I think that's something that we'll be looking into trying to leverage more to help building owners improve their facilities. And then leveraging that data to implement new policies and programs and financial tools that assist those building owners. And then we touched on before reducing the greenhouse gas emissions for the city. So just a reminder, this ordinance applies to building owners that own 25,000 square feet or larger facilities, and they're required to submit their water and energy, electric and natural gas usage to the city annually. In the first reporting period for the commercial building owners will be in 2023, I believe, with the 2019, so it'll be in 2022 with the data from 2019 through 2021. And then 1% of buildings in the city are actually over 25,000 square feet approximately. And that represents about 36% of the floor space within the city. So it's a small percentage of buildings, but they contribute some of the largest amount of emissions and energy use or resource use across the city. So those buildings represent about 44% of the building energy use in the city. And then some benefits to property owners and managers of pursuing the benchmarking of reporting to the benchmarking ordinance. It's an opportunity to identify hidden problems that they may not realize are there with their buildings in terms of building automation systems or equipment that's faulted in its controls and operating longer than it needs to be. Realizing energy savings opportunities throughout the facilities. And then informing where capital investments can make the biggest difference. This includes things like lighting and furnaces and new chillers. What are the pieces of equipment that are using the most energy within your facilities, and how can you make improvements to those to reduce your energy and resource water use? And ability to compare your performance to similar buildings. So the majority of commercial building owners will be reporting their data via Energy Star. And so they'll be able to benchmark their buildings across buildings nationally, but then also against local peer groups as well. So they'll really have an idea of how well their buildings perform and where they need to make improvements. And then it ultimately improves building comfort and value. Comfort for the building occupants, obviously, and then increases property asset values from a real estate perspective. So just some important deadlines I wanted to run through on the benchmarking program. City buildings, June 1st, 2019 was the initial reporting deadline for city building data, and then it'll be going public here at the end of this, at the beginning of July. And then non-city buildings, August 28th, 2020 for the 2019 data. And that's the reporting deadline. And then, like I mentioned before, the publication dates are July 1st, 2020 for the city buildings, and then July 1st, 2022 for the non-city buildings. And you can see there the metrics will be releasing. So timeline for benchmarking. This just gives you an idea of some of the major components of implementing the benchmarking ordinance that we've run through for this year. And I want to highlight here May 30th or later, a $50 late fee charge is going to be waived for 2019 data in light of COVID-19. And then we've extended the reporting deadline out to August 28th. We still do anticipate issuing violation fees if building owners do not submit their data. And so we're planning to complete that process in the fall of this year. And then, like I mentioned before, we're planning to recognize building owners for their achievements with regard to reducing their energy and water use within their facilities. And this program is still under development. We're looking at what other communities have done to incentivize building owners to take advantage of benchmarking to improve their facilities. And some of the examples out there are highest improvements in Energy Star scores, largest total reductions in energy and water use, and largest greenhouse gas emissions. But we'll certainly be looking at a breadth of ways to recognize building owners. And so I wanted to transition now over to the climate action planning process and talk about some key priorities in that effort. The city has already partnered with ICLEI, Iowa, with ICLEI and a cohort of Iowa Green Iowa AmeriCorps members to start implementing the climate action and adaptation planning process. That group will be working closely with us, as well as Iowa City, Cedar Falls, and a few other communities throughout Independence as well, and a couple others throughout the state. And we have those externs for the next 6 months to a year or so. And so I think a lot of the preparation work for gearing up for the climate action plan and climate action and adaptation plan will involve those externs and leveraging their skill sets to help us set some of the groundwork and framework for how we'll move forward in our process. And it will be a consensus-based approach that incorporates feedback from a broad coalition of stakeholders throughout the community. We certainly want to involve the task force. We know this is a large passion of yours and something that you've been waiting for a long time. And you will be, I think, an important part of that effort. And, you know, I would also mention that we're still finalizing what process we're going to be pursuing to implement the climate action and adaptation plan. And so as we gather this information and work through it, I think that's going to drive the framework for our plan. And right now, you know, we've got some of those externs through AmeriCorps working on gathering some examples of frameworks and timelines and different plans from throughout the country that we can help borrow some ideas from and guide our process moving forward. You know, and we'll be similar to what Barbara mentioned. I anticipate that we'll be looking at a lot of major issues that many of you have addressed: energy, transportation, solid waste, food systems, green space, equity. You know, and I think any climate action plan now would be remiss without addressing adaptation and resilience. You know, that's increasingly becoming a focus of funding opportunities for cities as well, whether that be through bonds or grants or support from the federal government. And having a climate action and adaptation plan would certainly help in ensuring that the city can continue to access funding opportunities and resources to help improve the city. And then getting buy-in from city officials and elected leaders will be an important step, certainly, in laying the framework for the climate action planning process. And that'll be a major component of my work moving forward. And thankfully, I think there are a lot of leaders within the city, both on the administrative and the elected officials side, that support this concept and want to help Des Moines move forward in its climate action and adaptation planning process. So just a timeline to give you guys a little sense of what this process will look like. So summer 2020, this year, which is, you know, coming up over the next several months here, we're going to be circling back on the greenhouse gas inventory that was conducted and reviewing that information and verifying that information, making sure that's all up to date and accurate, because that will be ultimately a baseline for a lot of the metrics that we'll be setting through the CAP process. And so we want to make sure that that data is accurate as we move forward. And then, like I mentioned, we'll be leveraging the externs to do some initial research and analysis to help us establish our framework. And then in the fall of this year, we're looking to establish that framework and draft our initial budget, and then seeking budget approvals in early next year, and issuing a request for proposal for consultants in the spring of 2021, and anticipate an executed contract by midsummer next year. Obviously, community and stakeholder workshops will certainly be impacted. Oops, hold on a second. Will certainly be impacted by the effects of COVID-19, and we'll have to certainly adapt to different ways of facilitating those moving forward, whether that's virtual efforts or smaller groups, but we'll certainly be taking that into account throughout the process. And then in the winter or spring of 2021, 2022, we'll be drafting that plan and then hoping to finalize that in summer of 2022. And I would just highlight that this is certainly still a work in progress, and this is our anticipated timeline, but that could change and shift over time. But we're hoping to stick to this as closely as we can. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to questions from folks. I need to circle back here and look at the chat. And see what we have in there for some questions.
It looks like Carrie had the first question.
Okay. And I just wanted to open it up real quick to other city staff and see if they have any other input that they want to provide, or we can dive into questions.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I think I've met with the task force several times before in the past. I'm familiar with a couple of you guys, but you know, this is an exciting time for us. We're a year into the benchmarking program, and so that's just it's been great to work on that project and to work with our building owners on that piece. And the climate action and adaptation plan is exciting. We're excited about it too, but we also need to focus on our benchmarking and sort of roll that out correctly first, and then move into the climate action plan. So we're really excited about all of it, but want to also be realistic with our time as well. And so, yeah, I think we'll jump into the questions. Jeremy and I can tag team on those.
Thank you very much for kind of doing this work in the interim. We really appreciate the work you've been doing. My question was just for the climate action plan. You know, it says climate action and adaptation. Is mitigation, I'm assuming, is going to be part of it as well? It's not just going to be adaptation and resilience?
Right. Mitigation is typically captured in that vulnerability assessment process. And then let me scroll down through here and see what else we have for some questions. How will the 2019 benchmarking data be accessed? That's going to be provided through our website. And we will have, Puck can provide a little more insight on this, but I think we're going to have a page dedicated to that information where citizens and the public can go to review that data.
Yeah, so we will be rolling out the city's data July 1, and then when it's time to roll out the public data in July 1st of 2022, it will look similar to what the city's data will look like. There might be some modifications modifications to that, because we'll have multi-year data at that point to show as well. But our preliminary thoughts, and this has to be built in by our IT still, is just that it would be similar to looking at a GIS map, right? You would see dots on that map of where the buildings are that need to report, and then you'd be able to click on a dot and see their information and whatnot. So that's how we are planning for it to work, and then we'll just need to work with our IT folks to build that component out. But yep, there will be a spot on the website for it. If you go to the benchmarking homepage right now, it would probably be on that front page somewhere.
I have a question. Is there any more questions on the chat? I can't.
I don't see any.
I had one.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just wondering, how are we going to factor in the COVID quarantine in terms of our energy benchmarking? Because a lot of those buildings, the energy use is going to be drastically reduced during this time, and so it's not going to reflect normal usage. So I don't know how we normalize that, and hopefully somebody is thinking about this, but I just wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, there's certainly going to be some variability in energy use, and I think no one's really sure yet exactly when we're going to be fully occupying all of these buildings throughout the city again, and when things will get back to absolute normal. But we have 2019 data that's coming in now, and then we'll have 2021 data and 2022 data. So if we need to, we can, we'll have a good baseline of at least 3 years to get an average of energy use across those facilities. And hopefully by that time, we'll have gotten through this current pandemic, and we'll have turned the corner on that.
Mm-hmm.
But we're certainly going to take a close look at that and figure out where we need to make some adjustments in that data or data reporting to reflect that.
Why don't we go to Carolyn's question, and then Kent had a question after that.
Yeah, being on the task force now going on 5 years, I just had a comment with a question. Looking at what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says about having 10 years to really get going locally on actions, and given the fact that we did as a city hire a 100% sustainability coordinator, manager, whatever you want to call it, and that was one of our requests for a long time. I just wonder what our role is as a task force for the next year in regards to really pushing this forward, number one, and number two, why I know that the benchmarking thing is important. Obviously, we work toward it being passed, but why can't the benchmarking be parallel with climate action planning now, rather than, it just seems like the
Anyone else not hearing Carolyn?
Yeah, Carolyn, I don't think we could hear the end of that question.
I just think why can't we be working parallel with the Climate Action Adaptation Plan and the benchmarking, rather than just emphasizing so much of the benchmarking? And it just looks like the Climate Action Adaptation Plan is being put on hold. And that's just what I'm getting from the presentation. I'm not saying that's the way it is, but I'm talking about, we've waited 5 years, almost 5 years in the fall of bringing this up when the Paris Climate Summit started in December 2015. It just seems like we locally spin our wheels too much. And I guess I want to comment about that because I'm a little bit disappointed in the timelines.
So if I can jump in quickly, Jeremy, and you can
Yep.
add to this, I would say that it's not put on hold. We've been a part of the ICLEI cohort that's been going on, that's been giving us some training on how to do a climate action plan. So I feel like we've already started the work. In addition to that, we have the 4 externs who are helping us do research and the kind of the behind the scenes stuff, helping us to really start thinking about when we do go out for RFP, if we choose to go down that route, what do we want that to look like? Where do we need additional expertise where we don't have it? And so I actually just wanted to also point out that Michaela is on this call, and she's one of our externs. And so I feel like in some sense we are already started, and we have already started. We have not made some formal council action, but that's definitely on our radar. But I also think that it's important to do our benchmarking well. We passed that ordinance. We want to implement that well. And I've been on borrowed time. And so now with Jeremy on board, he needs to transition into managing benchmarking. And there's just, that's a really big program. And so we wish we could just focus on the climate action plan, but realistically, we have committed to do the benchmarking piece as well, and we want to execute that well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm not saying that don't do the benchmarking. I'm just saying I guess I need to feel there's and it sounds like it is, that things are going forward. And for example, what kind of data is the AmeriCorps, Green AmeriCorps doing that you're waiting on? What kind of data is that?
Yeah, so we have the Green Iowa AmeriCorps volunteers who went through some trainings over the last several months with ICLEI on components of climate action and adaptation plans. And so we're working with these externs to identify some example plans out there of effective plans that have been implemented in other communities. There's certainly some of those resources that have been made available through the Sustainability Task Force as well. And so we're going to be referencing those too. But we're having them pull out timelines and frameworks and examples of the processes that other communities have gone through, because we really want to sort through that and identify what's worked effectively and what will work effectively here in Des Moines. And so we'll also be having them look into some examples of RFPs or proposals that have been put forward by consulting firms that have assisted in the full climate action planning process or components of the process. And we're not sure, like Pa mentioned, that that's the full route that we're going to go down, but it's certainly one of the more common approaches that communities have taken, and we'll be looking closely at that. And then I think we can have those externs start the process of identifying stakeholders within the community, community organizations that we'll need to work with, and how to engage with all of them, especially given our current circumstances, and they can help sort of model some of that. So really we're looking to leverage those externs as a way to get what might be work that would be done by a consultant completed beforehand, so that we don't necessarily have to pay as much when we get to that point of moving forward with the formal process. And certainly we want the Sustainability Task Force to be a key player in this effort. You're obviously a broad group of folks with a lot of different experiences and strengths and perspectives that can really help inform this process. And this is certainly, I think, as many of you have seen, a major undertaking and not something I can do by myself. So I want to leverage as much of the community partners as I can to execute this process. And I think.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to interrupt just because we're at time. We have 2 more questions. One from Kent Newman about STAR. I'll let him ask that. And then Allison had a question. And then we will probably have to wrap up. I hate to cut this short, but so Kent, did you want to jump in with your question?
Oh, thanks, Carrie. Hello, everybody. I wanted to ask Pa and Jeremy how the information from the STAR planning process is being implemented. And then I also share the concern about the delayed timeline of implementation of both programs and processes. And it sounds like a budget issue. Is it a budget issue? Thank you.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that, well, I mean, I don't know whether it's a budget issue or not. It's not in the current budget, but also I think more than anything, it's a staff capacity, right? You guys have asked for a long time for sustainability position to be created, which now it has been, and it's Jeremy. And so we need to give Jeremy some time too to get on board and rolling with it. And I think from a staff capacity piece, now that we have this one dedicated position to this, our plan is to move forward. We are with you. We want this climate action plan in place. We just want to be realistic about how many hours we ask Jeremy to work as well.
Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting transition coming on board virtually during this pandemic. And so I think that adds a little bit more time to my ability to get in there and develop good working relationships with leaders in other departments throughout the city and identify ways that we can collaborate with them moving forward on the sustainability initiatives. And so that's a big part of my work right now is having these virtual meetings with a lot of these folks. And there's certainly a lot of other programs and efforts that are underway throughout the city that as a sustainability professional, I think could certainly fall under the purview of sustainability or could benefit from some input from our program. And so I want to take a good close look at those too. And the climate action and adaptation planning process, I think, is one of the more important components of what we're going to be doing moving forward, because it's going to establish the short and long-term goals that we need to pursue as a community. And so a lot of the work we do moving forward around sustainability will be driven by that plan and the actions that we identify in that plan and what we prioritize. So it's as important for me to get that done as it is for you, so that I have an outline for what I'm going to be focusing on moving forward. But like Pa said, there's a lot to the benchmarking ordinance, and I want to make sure that we get that implemented correctly and that it benefits building owners and doesn't just become annual reporting aspect that they have, but that doesn't provide a lot of value back to them. So I want to figure out how to leverage that ordinance to improve public and private facilities throughout the city.
Yeah, and I want to just add that, I think the benchmarking ordinance is a key piece of a climate action plan too, because we know from our greenhouse gas emissions inventory that was completed by CEEE that commercial buildings account for 26% of our greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So I think that's good. So the other piece of Kent's question, I don't know, Jeremy, if you would be able to answer this because it's before your time, I think, even in Des Moines, but Pa, you might know, or Jim or Scott, is how the STAR community work that the city's been doing, how this gets incorporated into the climate action plan moving forward.
Yeah, so I was not working on that project, so I won't be able to speak to it quite as well. But I know we got recertified for STAR recently, and there was a lot of data gathering involved in that piece. I mean, anything that we do with the climate action plan, we're going to look back to see what have we've already done and build from there. So all the information that was gathered through the STAR recertification process will be our starting point as well or a point to use as well as we build our climate action planning pieces. As far as the specific outcomes of that, I wasn't on staff looking at that project, so I can't speak to that. But yeah, that's another task that Jeremy will, he's only been at the city for a short period of time, but that's another task that will be on Jeremy's plate, is to look at that STAR data in that certification process and incorporate that into our larger climate action plan.
And I would also add that if there are any of you on the task force that were involved in that process and have some good insight on the STAR program and that effort and what that represents for the city, certainly reach out to me, because I'm trying to absorb everything as quickly as I can here, and would certainly like some more information on that effort.
We clearly have enough work for you to do for the next 20 years.
This is Jim. I'll add a little bit to that.
Sure.
Just to say that a lot of these initiatives, they're not one or the other. I think we do have to think about, Carrie, you said it nice. We have to think about these as all drawing on each other. So the benchmarking program, I mean, that is going to help us towards our climate action plan. The STAR community planning and the data that we've collected will be used. They're all companion initiatives that all go towards the same goal. So we will use all that information.
Great, thank you. And let's go to the last question. Was Allison was asking about ICLEI. I'll let you ask your question, Allison.
Yeah, and we kind of just touched on it with the STAR stuff, and I feel some of the frustration in the group because a lot of what Barbara showed earlier with the tables, with all the different sections, we did that years ago, and so I feel that frustration with them, that it's been a while since we've done that. And so I guess I'm wondering, to add clarity for the group so they better understand what's coming out of this ICLEI and you and I work, are there work products? Are you going to know the process that you're going to walk out with? What are we going to get from that? Because it seems like that's going to take up a lot of time also, as well as everything else you've described here. But what are we walking away with from that? So then there's a little bit more clarity for this group on the process going forward.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Allison. I think, hold on a second. My camera's doing something funky. All right, there we go. I'm not too familiar, obviously, with that process that you all went through several years ago, but certainly if there are resources that were developed as part of that effort, I want to find them and I want to review them and make sure that we're leveraging them as much as possible in this current process. The externs, a major component of their work is also educational, where it's certainly, I think you know that, Allison, a learning opportunity for them as much as that is a job for them. And we're working closely with Eric Giddens and his team up at CEE to formalize that process and the work that they'll be doing as externs. And so we just had actually our first meeting with them last week to identify sort of the initial tasks that we want them to start looking into. I think a lot of what they do moving forward will be helping to formalize identify the formal pathway that we're going to move forward with for the climate action planning process. And that's something I certainly want to coordinate with all of you as well, so that you know, the stakeholders who are going to be sort of the main players in this effort all feel comfortable with the process that we're going to be moving forward with. And so I think we're still, it's early on, like I mentioned, for us and for myself in particular, in this climate action and adaptation planning process for the city specifically. And so we're still kind of developing the way we want to move forward with that. And, you know, I think if you ask us in a couple months what our thoughts are, we'll have a lot more information for you on what direction we think we'll be moving forward in with that.
Well, I'll just take an opportunity as we wrap up to thank Jeremy and Pa and Jim and Scott as well for sticking around this long. And I'm glad we can have a really frank conversation about, you know, where we're at and where we all want to get to and how much work lies ahead. And just to reiterate what we heard from Columbia, Missouri, that it's really vital to have city staff, elected officials, and also to have citizens to keep pushing the process along. And so I think we've heard all that tonight, that there's still a lot we can do in the short term. We don't have to, you know, we're not just waiting for a completed plan, but we're working together on that process, and we need to take bold action in the short term. And that's more than any one person has the capacity for, but that's why we're all here. And there's lots of other connections we can help to bring to support that. So thanks to all of you for presenting tonight and for working so hard on all this. And this task force has an ongoing strategic planning process. I think it's clear from this conversation that we need to keep thinking hard about what our role is, especially as the city's work continues to evolve. And so that'll be our next meeting, is to keep thinking about our plan as a task force and what we need to do in the short and longer term to keep this work going. So thanks to everybody. And we'll share this recording with others as well. If anybody wants to hang around, you can, but that's it for now. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great.
And Jeremy, we're really excited to have you on board, even if it felt like we threw you in the fire tonight.
No, please keep doing that. It keeps me on task and moving forward with all of this. Thank you.
Thanks to the city staff for being here tonight too. We appreciate that.
Yeah, very much.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
This was recorded. We saved the chat, so we'll share with everybody.
Great.